A common claim made by new atheists is that religious people are less intelligent, less rational, and less capable of engaging in analytical thinking. Some argue that this implies more intelligent people reject religious beliefs because they are more rational than believers. Many atheist academics have found this argument compelling as well. For instance, the social psychologist Miran Zuckerman, along with several other co-authors, have recently compiled a list of 83 studies into a meta-analysis and found that religious people are on average less intelligent than atheists. And according to them, our findings support the view that intelligent people are less religious because they are more rational. Similarly, Helmorth Nyborg said, "Cognitively complex people typically resort to reason, science, and data to reduce uncertainty, whereas people lacking this cognitive protection often resort to ancient supernatural beliefs and claims." Since the argument seems to be pervasive among both academics and new atheists alike, it needs to be addressed once and for all. Let's start with the claim that atheists reject religious beliefs because they are more rational. Without even diving into the data, it is pretty clear that this claim is not supported by this study, and is very close to being a correlation-causation fallacy. Saying that atheists reject commonly held religious beliefs because they are more rational implies a causal relation between atheism and rationality. But this meta-analysis was only correlational in nature, which would mean little to no evidence of causality. This study doesn't even provide tentative support for a causal link between rationality and atheism, because whether a belief is rational or irrational depends on whether the person holding it has sufficient justification for the belief, not on whether the person holding the belief is intelligent. Let's consider the case of John Nash, who was the subject of a movie A Beautiful Mind. He was obviously a very highly intelligent, Nobel laureate mathematician, who suffered from paranoid schizophrenia, and as a result, formed delusional beliefs about the world. Or consider the fact that peer-reviewed studies have found that higher levels of intelligence can cause people to develop a bias, called bias blind spot, and very well may end up forming beliefs from implicit biases instead of through rational and unbiased inquiry. Basically, people with higher intelligence do not differ from people of lower intelligence in the likelihood of possessing 6 out of 7 possible cognitive biases. Researchers have found across multiple studies that people higher in cognitive abilities do not at all display lower levels of confirmation bias or other cognitive biases. In fact, despite on average not being statistically different than people of lower IQ, high IQ people are ironically more likely to display a bias blind spot, and so are more likely to be unaware of their own biases compared to the general population. To quote, "More cognitively sophisticated participants show larger bias blind spots. This somewhat surprising finding extended to 6 of the 7 biases." The point being, there are numerous psychological factors that contribute to how beliefs are formed. It is not just based on intelligence. So the conclusions of this study don't logically follow, even if there's a correlation between atheism and intelligence. But let's dive deeper into the data, because the study really unravels in many different ways. The study analyzed 83 studies on the relation between intelligence and religious belief. In their own words, they write, "Our evidence shows that correlations in an updated data set between intelligence and religious beliefs range from an R value of -0.2 to -0.23, similar to the -0.2 to -0.25 range obtained by Zuckerman and others." First, the study really doesn't define religiosity well. It purports to find a negative correlation between the variable religious belief and low intelligence, but when we pull up the individual studies listed in the meta-analysis, it becomes clear that intelligence is mostly correlated negatively to fundamentalism and not mainstream religious beliefs. For instance, the meta-analysis claims that Louis Ritchie and others found a negative correlation between religious beliefs and intelligence. But when we actually pull up the study itself, it actually found a -0.25 correlation between fundamentalism and intelligence. This really isn't a large correlation to begin with. But when it came to mainstream religious beliefs, like answering yes to the question, "I look to God for strength, support, and guidance," it found a negative 0.1 correlation. Just to put that into perspective, a 0.1 correlation is so small, it is right on the border of non-significant. It's a correlation which cannot even be discerned by looking at a scatter plot. And a correlation of 0.1 would mean that intelligence explains 1% of the variance in mainstream religiosity in a given population, and 99% of the variance is due to other factors. So the first error this study makes is that it fails to differentiate between different forms of religiosity. This meta-analysis oversampled outlier minority views, such as fundamentalism, biblical literalism, and sectarianism, but represented it as a correlation between general religious belief and low intelligence. But it gets worse from this point onward. Overall, the study authors found a negative 0.2 correlation between fundamentalist beliefs and intelligence. What does this translate to in terms of IQ scores? Are atheists on average 2 points more intelligent? 50 points more intelligent? When my collaborators and I couldn't figure out a good answer to this question, we emailed Miron Zuckerman, the lead author of the study. We couldn't figure out the answer to this question for a good reason, because Zuckerman and his co-authors couldn't accurately quantify the practical consequences of this finding either. They could not even give a ballpark figure of how much more intelligent atheists are compared to fundamentalists or even religious believers on a standard IQ test. It's impossible to really know, because in order to understand what a negative correlation of 0.2 really means, one must assume that the data is normally distributed. That is, religiosity, when plotted on an x and y axis, should resemble a bell-shaped curve. But when it comes to religious belief, as it is in this meta-analysis, that is not the case. The studies used in the meta-analysis typically relied on sample sizes that correlated to the general population. For instance, the following graph shows the distribution of people by religious belief in the United States, taken from a recent survey by the Pew Foundation. 63% of people stated that they are absolutely certain that God exists, while 20% stated that they are fairly certain. There's almost nobody in the middle, and finally, there's a spike on the right-hand side, with 9% saying that they are sure God does not exist. This data is not normally distributed because when it's plotted on an x and y axis, it doesn't have a bell shape. It is skewed, which means that the peak of the data, instead of found in the middle, like a bell-shaped curve, is shifted to the left or to the right. In this case, the left peak is much larger than the other half of the graph, with believers outnumbering atheists almost 9-1. The data the researchers used also had a skewed distribution, with atheists representing less than 10% of the samples. For example, Nyberg used 10% of atheists, Lewis and Ritchie used 1%. This is important because the correlation equation that the authors relied on overestimates the actual correlation when it is calculated for skewed data. Now, in order to demonstrate how meaningless the results were, we went to a website called socialsciencestatistics.com, which allowed us to calculate the correlations of various data, called the R-value. Here, we've entered some hypothetical data into two tables, in order to model how the correlation of the R-value gives totally misleading results for skewed data. Into the left-hand table, we've entered religiosity scores of 11 people on a scale of 1 to 5. A score of 5 means one is absolutely certain that God exists, while a 4 means one is fairly certain God exists, and a 1 means one is absolutely certain that God doesn't exist. In the right-hand table, we've entered various hypothetical IQ scores for these 10 people. I want you to notice that the IQ scores are all roughly the same. When we click to calculate the R-value, it gives us a correlation of negative 0.38 between religious conviction and IQ, which is a much greater correlation than the negative 0.2 correlation found in the meta-analysis. Now at first, this sounds like an impressive correlation, but the only problem is that the average IQ for people who are absolutely certain that God exists is 100. The average IQ of people who are fairly certain that God exists is 102.3, and the average for atheists is 101. In other words, the IQ of people who are absolutely certain that God exists is 1 point lower than atheists, which is a totally trivial result. Notice the negative correlation between intelligence and religiosity came from the skewed data, even though all these IQ scores were roughly the same. there were more religious subjects than non-religious subjects, thus making it appear in the R value as though the IQ of atheists was higher, when actually this wasn't the case. But it gets even worse than that, because I can actually boost the IQ of people who are absolutely certain that God exists to a value higher than atheists, and still get a seemingly significant negative correlation between IQ and religiosity. I've entered the following values into the R value calculator, and got a negative 0.15 correlation between religious conviction and IQ. But in this instance, the group which was absolutely certain that God exists had a mean IQ of 102.2. The group which was fairly certain that God exists had an IQ of 106, and atheists had the lowest IQ of the group at 102. As you can see, when compared to a few hypotheticals, the R value, which the authors calculated in their meta-analysis, is totally useless when applied to non-normally distributed or skewed data, because the negative correlation they found would translate to trivial differences in IQ. This is pretty much why all statistics textbooks recommend calculating a totally different measure of correlation, called Spearman's Rho, instead of the R value, for data which is skewed or has outliers. So the second error the authors made is calculating a totally incorrect measure of correlation. So the practical consequences and the conclusions that could be drawn from this study are zero. In all honesty, I could just stop here, but I think that this meta-analysis is a good case study of what can go wrong when the authors end up unintentionally shoehorning their implicit biases into the data. We've already seen that the author's definition of religiosity was highly flawed, but how they measured intelligence was just as bad. The gold standard measures of intelligence are called the Wechsler Adult Scale of Intelligence, or WIS for short, and the Stanford-Binet test. But the overwhelming majority of studies included in the meta-analysis did not correlate religiosity to these gold standard measures of intelligence. They correlated religiosity to tests which only moderately correlate to the gold standard test for intelligence. For instance, 8 out of the 83 studies compared scores on the word sum test between religious believers and atheists, and found a negative correlation between intelligence and religiosity. Scores on the word sum test correlate to scores on the gold standard measures of intelligence, like the WIS, with an R value of 0.4 to 0.7. This would normally not be a problem except for one thing. The authors excluded many studies in their final meta-analysis, and they called this data cleaning. They excluded studies which correlated GPA to religiosity, but GPA correlates to intelligence with an R value of 0.3 to 0.7, which is about the same for tests which they did include, like the word sum tests. So it is odd and arbitrary that they utilize word sum test results or other miscellaneous tests like the employee aptitude surveys, but excluded GPA, when multiple studies have found to have GPA correlate with IQ just as much as word sum tests. When they did include GPA, the link between intelligence and fundamentalist religious beliefs was reduced to a trivial level. The R value was reduced from 0.2 to 0.09. That's even less than a small correlation, and most experts would say that this result would be too small to have any practical significance. Finally, the meta-analysis mainly relies on studies in the United States. This is a concern because several papers, including a study from 2018, that directly criticized the original 2013 meta-analysis for this limitation, have found that in post-Christian countries, such as England, the link between analytical thinking and religiosity not only becomes non-significant, it actually reverses. In other words, in post-religious countries, the data shows atheists think less analytically than religious individuals. The authors suspect that in cultures where institutional religion is waning and where acceptance of atheism arises from tendencies to conform, it is possible that cognitive reflection may predict the rejection of atheism, a matter for future investigation. In other words, people with low analytical intelligence simply tend to conform to the majority view in any given culture. In the United States, where the majority is still religious, people with low analytical skills conform to what the majority belief is. And in cultures where religion is declining, people with low analytical skills also conform to what the majority belief is. So in conclusion, this 2019 updated meta-analysis suffers from several flaws. such as ambiguously defining and conflating various different types of religiosity, excluding studies that focus on GPA scores, which would have significantly lowered the impact of the findings, used incorrect measures of correlation like Pearson's R, and relied too heavily on studies from the US, ignoring the fickle nature on an international level. Ultimately, the methods of this meta-analysis have too many issues to draw meaningful results, and thus, there is no reason to suggest that higher levels of analytical thinking lead to atheism.